Ruby, hi. Nice to face meet you.
Yes, thank you so much for being willing to do this with me. It's nice to meet you.
Yeah, yeah, of course, no problem.
I really appreciate you being willing to do like these type of conversations with people on our side, the political spectrum. I know that some other like characters on the left don't like to engage honestly with us, so I do really appreciate the fact that you will like have these debates and discussions with people like Jordan and what was the other guy, Dustin. I remember you did a discussion with him,
Oh
so
yeah,
I
he's a
appreciate
character.
that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm pretty, I don't think anyone's beyond reproach. And I'm sure you guys are thinking like, oh, red pillar, and I'm thinking like, oh, blue pill you, but
I just,
I
I
mean,
like to like learn from other people, have conversations, right?
yeah.
It's good to
Yeah,
have like
yeah,
that
me
open
too.
dialogue.
It's something I've had some people like give me some shit for recently because they're like, you're platforming people, and I'm like, I don't even have like a huge channel, so I can't even comprehend like people being like me platforming. Like, I don't know. So, but I'm just kind of taking it as it goes. So, I like talking to all you weirdos.
I remember you said something about how like you're like a pseudo masochist because you went on like incel channels and whatnot. I thought that was pretty
Yeah,
funny.
I just can't. I don't know why. I've always been like really. I'm someone who spent like a lot of time online, so I've
Hmm.
ended up just like on the dark corners of the internet. And I think it's really interesting the way that the internet's affected like this new type of social grouping,
Hmm.
these more like people becoming more radicalized or, just the whole phenomena of like incels in general is really interesting to me. And, I'm like a feminist and I feel like a lot of feminists sometimes gloss over some issues that like men face in that arena. So I try to be, it's something I'm interested in and like extending like what is it, like an olive leaf or
Yeah, the
fig
olive
or,
branch,
yeah, whatever.
a
You know what
charitable
I mean?
hand. We appreciate that.
Yeah,
As a representative of the male population, I appreciate that.
yeah. Yeah.
So today I guess we're talking about objective morality then, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I have like a passing interest.
Hmm.
Also, is my headset could be like a little annoying if it's
Oh no, it
not
seems to
even
work good. Yeah.
all right. Yeah, I have like a pretty casual like passing interest in like moral philosophy. It's
Hmm.
something I'm kind of in the process, like via conversations and whatnot, figuring out where I lie. As of right now, I describe myself as like being more of like a moral
Hmm.
subjectivist. I just can't uh, I just haven't been able to comprehend like a secular case for objective morality.
Hmm.
So
Sure. Yeah.
if you can present one, I'm all ears. I just yeah, I
Yeah.
have a hard
That's
time.
that's kind of what I figured, kind of where you were at, based on like your debate with was it Mr. Dustin and Jordan B. I remember like on the topic of like abortion, when immediately when it came up, you said like, "Oh, do you guys think that you can prove that there is objective morality without like reference to a deity?" And then Dustin said something like, "Yes, I can," and then he kind of just moved away from it really quickly, and then it seemed like it was just a conversation between him and Miss Avalon, I think is her
Oh
name, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So it seemed like that was kind of like the conversation that was going on there, and I was like, oh, someone should have like brought that up because meta ethics, which is the conversation about is there objective morality, the conversation about nihilism and moral relativism, and that comes way before we have applied ethics, right? So we have like meta ethics, and then we have to talk about normative ethics, which is about like
Hmm.
why should I care about morality? Perhaps you could say the benefits of being moral, and then a moral system, where that is like a virtue ethics system or utilitarianism or deontology. These are very official terms, and we don't have to get into any of those today. And then you can go into, okay, now let's try to apply these to ethics. And they kind of just skipped right over to applied ethics, and that's a great way to cause a lot of confusion and misunderstanding, I feel like.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I've watched enough. I don't know if you watch any Destiny debates, but
Yeah.
he always like right at the beginning has to be like, all right, you know what prescriptive, descriptive, and normative means, because
Hmm.
anytime it's like not like clarified beforehand, it can be like very confusing because most people uh when they go into like any debate about moral issues, they aren't really even thinking about it from like a meta ethical perspective. They just kind of take certain things for granted, and sometimes you have to do that. That's kind of
Hmm.
like honestly how I go about it. Like if I'm discussing just like a normal issue, like say for example like animal rights, I don't have to be have the exact same moral philosophy as someone to maybe make a case of like, oh, do you think it's bad to make things suffered. Like, you could always
Yeah.
go from just the basic axiom of like suffering and well-being. So that's kind of like my approach in general when talking about it. So I've been like, my default, like, I when I first got interested, I was like into like Peter Singer, and he's
Mm-hmm.
like super utilitarian.
Yeah. Yes.
But it's there's so many issues with that, where it's
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, would you kill like a million people today if it made like 10 million people
Yeah.
happier in like 5 years? So that's why I'm not really fully settled on that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, yeah. Utilitarianism. There's a lot of debate even amongst utilitarians, which kind they prefer. Like, there's like the Jeremy Bentham type, which are the ones like you're referring to about like just happiness, and then there's the other ones that are like John Stuart Mill type of utilitarians who are interested in like maximizing liberty. They see liberty
Hmm.
as like their form of happiness or well-being. But again, that's like normative ethics. Before we can begin there, we have to talk about moral realism. And let me
Hmm.
just, if it's okay, if I can just lay down a few like definitions, so that like
Yeah, sure.
we know what kind of what we're working with here.
I mean,
And this,
I would
mm-hmm,
identify myself as like a moral anti-realist, I guess. I
mm-hmm,
don't believe in like moral
yeah,
facts as something that exists
mm-hmm,
outside of like, what we can consciously perceive. So that's
yeah.
kind of like my base. I have like a pretty rudimentary like understanding though, but that's like my baseline.
No, that's well, you know the vocabulary. Yeah, moral anti-realist. That's good. It's a great place to begin. So, for a moral realist, what I would mean by that, for like when I'm referring to myself as a moral realist, I'd be talking about like moral judgments, and like a moral judgment would be like a moral proposition that I hold to or express, that can be like true or false, independent of just my one person or any like groups, like preferences or desires or beliefs. These moral judgments would be what we call in like philosophy necessarily true. So they would be
Hmm.
true like for all people at all times and everywhere. And I think it's important to say that I don't think that moral judgments are independent of like minds. And so I'm not trying to make the claim that moral judgments are like existing in like the Platonic realm or in some like abstract sphere or something of that kind.
Hmm.
And I'll probably like get into what I mean by that. So yeah, you said you're in like an ethical relativist. So you believe that it's like up to like your preference and taste. I imagine then it's kind of like
I
a
mean, when it
on a
boils down to
the
it,
truth is in the subject, right?
yeah, I believe that all morals, like I believe it's an evolved system
Hmm.
that we created for group fitness, and that, each group is, doing what's best for, the group, and that's the maximizing well-being, minimizing suffering, and also so you're fit is to compete with other groups. So I view it from like a evolutionary perspective. Um,
Hmm.
and but honestly, I mean, if there was a good case for objective morality, obviously that would be preferable, because when you're uh, a moral like subjectivist, there's obviously a bunch of unfortunate realities that come with that. So I just have to cope with that like existential dread every day. So I'd rather not, you know.
Maybe I can
That's
help you with that then. Maybe,
yeah,
hopefully.
ideally.
Which is why I kind of wanted this to be a discussion forum, because I knew that you seemed at least from my like watching some like what you had said in the past, like kind of open to this. So thought, okay, maybe I have a chance to like change your mind here. And believing in objective morality by no means will like shift your worldview. In fact, it'll probably help you be a better, you can be more concrete in your compassion or your whatever leftist principles that you want to like apply to a situation. They can be backed up, I guess, with a little more force, perhaps. So I'm not in any way saying that you have to now like abandon your whole worldview, which I feel like that'd probably be preferable for you, right?
Yeah. I mean, unless there was a better
Mm-hmm.
worldview, But yeah, I mean, I think an objective morality would gel fine with my general
Mm-hmm.
worldview. It'd obviously make things simpler. It'd be easier to make a compelling case to people if I could have some like, higher value to appeal to
For sure, yeah.
preferences. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so let me just make a few more definitions here, and then I'll go into what I call like there's three arguments that I believe kind of form like a trifecta. I think they all kind of lean on each other, and these are like the three best ones I've read, and so they all kind of like support each other for like a the moral realist case. But before I can get into that, I kind of have to explain some other definitions, because I saw like one of Destiny's debates where he was
Hmm.
talking to someone about moral like realism, and they didn't really, I think, have some good definitions. Like he's like, oh, what is objectively true? And the guy's like, oh, it just means it's like valid or something like that. So I feel like I gotta lay
Yeah.
this down. So for objectively true, what I mean here is I believe in what's called like the correspondence theory. And basically what it means is that like some proposition would be true if and only if it like corresponds to some fact, which is like truth making. The fact would make the proposition true. So it's basically some concept that is united with an object. And so basically there's two different kinds of objectivity. One is what's called like vertical objectivity, where you're matching a subject matter that is in like reality or the external world with the concept. So like the concept of my hand with the the actual object here, the fact that my hand exists. I can say it's objectively true, right, that my hand is here. And so that's one version of objectivity. The version I'm talking about though today is what is called like horizontal objectivity. And that is a procedurally correct processes fitting some like rules that are intersubjectively valid. And let me get into what that means here. But intersubjective, by that I just mean that there is some like consensus as to what like the fact is amongst various individuals. And so if we have, let's just say for the sake of argument, this is probably like the best example I can give outside of like giving philosophical examples. Just like more practical, concrete examples here would be like imagine, let's just say that we all agree that the court systems are fair. I know that's probably definitely not something we all agree on in this country, especially right now. But imagine if we all just said that, okay, the court systems are fair, and then someone was tried through the court systems, they came out innocent, then we'd say, oh, they're objectively then proven innocent, they've gone through the right processes, therefore, like, the right result follows from that. That's kind of like the moral fact there. Or it's not the moral fact, sorry. That's the fact right there. The proposition was now that they're innocent. It corresponds. And so, sorry, 1 second.
Oh, good. Wait, do you vape? I was like,
no, this was a water bottle.
Oh, I was like, I've watched like a debate of me and I'm vaping the whole time.
Yeah,
So like,
I've seen that. Yeah,
I'm always like eager if like someone else vapes. I'm like feel like less of a douchebag, but whatever.
No, it's all good. I smoke a pipe, but I don't know if that counts for anything.
So you smoke a pipe?
Yeah, it's like I feel like it's more sophisticated, and so like it fits kind of like my attire and my like trying to picture my brand I'm trying to create.
How old are you? I'm just curious.
Oh, I'm 20 years old.
You're 20.
Yeah.
Why are you into all this weird shit?
Oh, like philosophy or like right-wing politics?
I guess I meant more like smoking from a pipe is very and also I don't know much about your general perspectives, but I know I feel like I associate with like incel. Is that that's weird. Not saying it like in a bad way, but just in like let's say a factual way of like it's abnormal from the, normies or whatnot.
No, for sure. Yeah, I wouldn't classify myself as an incel. I know I have a show where like I call it incel, and then I it's like an acronym that stands for Identitarian Nationalist Conservative Esoteric Legion, and I was kind of, it's a spoof on the kid series Nerds, which was like a book about like spies, and the acronym for that was like National Espionage Rescue and Defense Society. And so it's just like a spoof, but no, I'm not an incel in the fact that...
so you're not even, because I watched part of your reviewing of my like OnlyFans.
Oh wow, you watched my content. I'm flattered right now.
Oh, of course. I mean, I'm not that popular of a YouTuber, so I think my videos have been reviewed like by 2 different people. So I came across but the thing is, I hate watching myself played back. So I, whenever I see like a video of someone like watching me, it's so hard to like. No, I think I watched like 10 minutes, but that's where I saw the incel. So that's where I was at the mindset.
Oh, I got you. I consider myself kind of like a volcel. Some people say that's a cope. I don't think so.
I consider myself a volcel, believe it or not. Truly.
Yo, base femoid. All right.
Exactly.
One of us. All right, that's cool. In any case, why am I into pipes? It's just like I said, it's kind of just like my thing. I'm kind of quirky like that. So I guess that's the explanation there. Don't have much more to say about that. That's just preference, man. That's just taste. What we're talking about though is like, what is objective and necessary. Alright, so transitioning back real quick to what we're talking about. So like I said, we're talking about like these processes, right? And so when I say moral facts, let me just define that real quick as well. So a moral fact would be something that's categorically valid. And so it'd be like a categorically valid action driving imperative. And so what I mean by categorically invalid would be different than hypothetically like valid. So if I say like, oh, I want to live healthily, therefore I will start eating, or I ought to start eating, I don't know, vegetables or something that like that, right? So that would be something that's hypothetical, because it's like you subjectively value the antecedent and then the consequent follows. It's like that's kind of the relationship it forms. But this would be like defeasible as like an objective moral code, because simply you could just say, well, I don't want to live healthily. Why should I live healthily? And then you like that's when you run into problems, right? Does
Yeah,
that make
yeah,
sense?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I
So when
got
I
you.
say categorically, I mean it's like it would be universal and necessary. Universal applies to all people, necessary all times, everywhere, all places, that kind of
Hmm.
spiel. And so now when I'm talking about the moral law here, I'm saying that like this moral law is presupposed even before we begin to like exercise what I would call like practical reason, right, in which we like interact with our both like our internal monologue and other rational agents. And so I'm saying basically that this presupposition is going to apply to all agents intersubjectively because we're all rational, and if we all reason correctly, insofar as like we had the right processes of reasoning here, we'd all arrive at the same like objective moral code, because I would say like the right process has taken place. That's kind of
Hmm.
what I mean here by like the horizontal objectivity. And so basically what I'm going to try to prove is that there is some code that is presupposed before we can even begin to reason or to interact with other rational agents that would kind of stipulate like certain constraints on how we should interact with them.
Hmm.
So does that make kind of more sense now?
Yeah, I
Like where
can
I'm
I can
coming
see
from?
like the angle that you're coming from, but
Okay.
I'm still
I
the
haven't
thing I
proved it
don't.
yet, so I'm just like making sure you can understand like the definition.
Yeah, I'm just already trying to predict like what route you
Hmm.
would go with that. But I guess you can. Yeah, you can go ahead.
All right, so my first argument here is going to be from what's called like moral experience.
Hmm.
And so the premises go something like this. We generally kind of take for granted that our senses tell us something true about reality, right? That is to say, unless like we're profoundly confused or like profoundly deceived, our sense experience correlates to something true about the external world. For example, like I don't need like a philosophical proof to prove that my grandma exists. I don't need
Hmm.
like a peer-reviewed study. No peer-reviewed study needed. I don't need like some inductive or deductive argument there. It's just something that like correlates with my sense experience. And like I said, unless we're profoundly confused, I can say that I'm justified in believing that my grandma does exist.
Hmm.
And so it seems to me, at the very least, the existence of the external world around me, which exists, independent of my mind, does in fact exist. I think that at the very least, I'm justified in asserting that just from like my sense experience alone, and that I'm not like a brain in a vat, or that I'm being deceived by evil demons. That I'm justified in asserting that my sense experience does tell me that there is an external reality.
What about simulation?
Yeah, and
See, that's
so,
the thing, because I would question
mm,
you even there about the being able to know for a fact that this isn't
mm,
all like a simulation or some type of,
yeah,
our
and you
brains could be
you don't
hallucinating
know that.
something.
That's
Yeah,
the
so
that's the thing.
yeah.
It's possible. It's possible. Like logically, it's possible that is true, but no one acts like that's true. And so
Hmm.
this is why I'm very clear to have the constraints around practical reason, because the way practical reason works, it's about how we live our life day to day. And so
Hmm.
and just as I think that like theoretic reason, which is kind of like what is logically possible and what maybe like pure math would tell us or things like that, is going to be a little bit different than our practical day to day reasoning.
Hmm.
And so that's why I'm saying that I feel like I'm justified in asserting that there is an external reality, that you do exist, and these things happen. Like unless like you can like show me some great defeater, and like the why I would be confused, I seem
Hmm.
justified as it's just like what is called Alvin Plantinga. He calls it this like properly basic truth. It's just something that is just presupposed before we can even begin to act. Right? It's
Yeah,
just like
yeah.
something we all have just assumed it's true. And so, in a very similar way, I'm going to argue that there's a shared moral experience, as if it's almost like a sixth sense. I have like a moral sense, and this informs me how I ought to live and others ought to act. And so, therefore, at the very minimum, and I'll motivate that premise in a minute, but it seems if like the if there's like an isomorphic relationship in which like they're both like in other words, there's like a symmetry between like our moral experience and our sense experience, then at the very least, or at the like the very minimum, in the absence of some great defeater, and I imagine you'll present me some, it seems like I'm justified in asserting that there does exist this hypothetical, a moral realm where moral facts do exist, just from my moral experience. And now, imagine you want to know what I like, what I mean by moral experience, or do you have any like questions before I go on to
Well,
that?
the thing is,
Mm.
so is this something that would exist outside of you, and or are you just you're talking
No.
purely in relation to like your sense experience, and that's
Mm.
how you can pertain its existence by?
I'm kind of making a symmetry here is what I'm
Uh-huh.
trying to make, that the justification for the external world is going to be the same justification I have for my moral my belief that there are moral values, that the sense that they're both properly basic, that there is an objective moral code is just properly basic before we can even begin to have practical reason. The same way uh, my belief that there is the existence of an external world is just properly basic before I can begin to interact with people. And so that shares that symmetry is kind of what I'm trying to argue here.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
I think so. You can keep like kind of
Okay.
elaborate at it.
I think I think it'll come become more clear as I give some more examples here.
Gotcha,
And I
gotcha.
have like three, I guess, just examples that are going to appeal to like what I'd say, like I said, our intuition or just our practical, our basic practical knowledge. And the first is like our primordial instincts that you might see in children. And so if like you ever watch like children who are like playing a game, or like dodgeball or kickball or something like that, they have this intuitive understanding of what like fairness is. And if someone like cheats, everyone's going to call them out on that. They say, "Hey, you ought not to do that." And so there's an implicit realization that when you agree to like the rules of something, that you have to follow through with them. This isn't something that like I think that you have to like explicitly teach to kids. Some kids probably you have to do that, but as like a general rule, and generally speaking, I think kids, if you interact with them enough, you'll see that that's like something that they just intrinsically know, is that you have to be fair, and that when someone is not playing by the rules, they say, "Hey, that's not fair." And there's this implication there that this person is doing something wrong and that they shouldn't be doing that. So that there's a moral code that would definitely apply to them immediately, just from from your just like primordial instinct tells you that. And so this like there already exists here with even like children, and bringing that up just so like it makes it seem like it's not something that's going to be manufactured through society. This
Mm-hmm.
normative constraint, or like the moral fact that we'd be able to grasp. So that's like one of the first examples. My second would be that we are very prone to decry moral atrocities. And so even like you mentioned, like, oh, maybe morals are just something that comes from like our group evolving. And so I think that the problem with some of that like that mindset is that we want to decry moral atrocities in cross cultures, even with individuals who are complete strangers. I mean, not imagine, but I imagine that like when you watch like the tape of George Floyd, the officer was named Derek Chauvin, kneeling on,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, he was kneeling on his neck for was 9 minutes or whatnot. I imagine you felt this visceral like gut instinct that what happened was morally objectionable, that there was something that must be done to correct this, that there's just this action compelling obligation on your part that we must seek justice. And you didn't think that, oh, well, this is like, okay, this is just, Derek Chauvin's morality and I have my own taste or something like that. Instead, you immediately knew that there was something off about this. This is what I would call your moral sense experience there. And I don't think that this is like a normal or the same feeling as like a disgust. Like if I see like a centipede out in the wilderness, I see it as disgusting. But I don't see myself as necessarily needing to correct like the existence of a centipede by like killing it.
Mm-hmm.
If it's out in the wild, if it's in my house, it might be a different situation. But if I'm like out in the jungle and I see a centipede, I'm not gonna recognize that that's where centipedes exist. So I don't think that this is the same as a disgust, and I don't think it's the same as just a normal type of anger, in which like an emotional type of anger, in which like if I like had a bad day at work, like I punch a hole in the wall or something like that. It seems to me, at least from my own moral sense experience, and you can perhaps, if you disagree, you can. I'm more than happy to hear your perspective on this. It seems to me that there is a different like feeling of righteous indignation when you see something like this happen on television. Uh, and so this does seem like there's this action driving premise that demands justice, that demands correction, that would inform me that I'm justified in thinking there is some objective moral code.
So what I would say to that
Mm-hmm.
is, say like you have a baby who's born into an empty room, lives its whole life with no output or input, like experience from other
Yeah.
like social creatures, and then that baby, well, the adult at this point, steps outside, sees the TV, and it's the George Floyd killing. Do you think that person
Hmm.
would have that visceral reaction to it? Do you think?
Hmm. And so I guess my response to that would be, I don't think it's a like a Cartesian innate value or innate idea. Insofar as I don't think that like people are born with like the moral code completely written in their lives. I think instead that it's like a mix. I think it's what like I think Chomsky talks about this when it comes to like grammar. That it's going to be something that takes. There's going to be some material like cause, something in reality that's going to spark this growth in you. And I think that like that spark is just going to be your immediate interaction with any other rational individual. So I think as you like immediately interact with another rational individual, or perhaps if you interact with your own internal monologue, but I think that it really does have to be another individual. You begin to develop the idea of like a feeling of like just and unjust, if that makes sense. And that's like kind of similar to like Chomsky's idea of like grammar. That if you like have a child, in a room, and I think they did like an experiment like this. It was like horrible, but it was like they had
They don't do any of those like kinds of
yeah.
like super fucked up experiments
Yeah,
anymore, but
and
there are some
again,
that exist. Yeah.
that's again because we say they're fucked up because we have this moral experience that it's wrong to torture children, right? It's like we see them and it's just like intuitively we know it's like a visceral reaction. And so, like, if you like keep them in a room, they wouldn't be able to develop like the English language. But he still thinks that there's something innate to the way we come to grasp language, and he was able to show that by looking at like comparing different like grammatical structures across different worlds, or rather, different like regions and cultures and whatnot. I believe
Mhm.
I'm not like super familiar with his work, but I know it's like a soft form of innate like values. So I'd compare it to something like that. I think it would be like my best estimation of that. So yeah, I think that if someone interacts to a sufficient degree with other people and they saw what happened with George Floyd, they would feel that like the feeling of like just innate like disgust about what is happening, or feel like they needs to be justice or correction or whatnot.
But
Uh,
I still like the way I see it is it still boils down to like a preference.
mm,
Even as that sounds like awful,
mm,
I still see it that way because you have like a preference. Even like say something like empathy that we think of as virtuous, it really isn't. It's like an evolved trait where I don't want to see someone else suffer because it hurts me.
mm,
Do you know what I mean? So it's like
yeah.
basically it's just that's where the preference is coming from, is because we have this evolved trait so that our groups would like survive better.
Mm.
What would you say to that?
All right, so yeah, the evolution question. Maybe I can do like the last one and then I'll get into the evolution question
Sure.
because I have some stuff written down. I predicted that that would come up. So the last one here, and then I'll address that. So let me just table that for a second. I will get to it, though, I promise. The last like I guess you could say a sign of like my moral sense experience is that like I make sense of moral progress or moral degress, or
Hmm.
even like the potential for such a thing. And so, like with the re-election of Donald Trump coming up, I imagine you think there is progress. Excuse me, there is potential for moral progress if Trump loses the election, and I imagine you would think that there's moral degress or that things have gotten worse morally if he wins the election. And like another example would be like the abolition of slavery. No one says like, oh, culture just arbitrarily changed when slavery was eradicated in the United States because of the 13th Amendment. Yeah, it's just what happened. No, we say that this is something good, that we've made moral progress, that we all say this is meaningful, this is ought to be celebrated. And so that without a objective moral code, you can't make sense. It's not really intelligible. Any sense of like there's something that's good happening or bad happening within our historical context.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, let me go to now. Yeah, so talking about the evolution here, and I think there's a few things we have to keep in mind. The first is that even if like some value is arrived at through evolutionary processes, like you said, altruism or like compassion or something like that, then it doesn't mean that there's still no longer any value to it, or that there's no moral value to that. I
Hmm.
think that would be committing like what's called like the genetic fallacy,
Hmm.
in which you're saying that because the origination is X, therefore it invalidates like the feeling or the claim. And so just saying that, oh, this is the result of evolution, in no way says that no longer therefore is altruism a something that's like morally virtuous. Instead, you can just say that they're just like a gnomic equivalence, where they simultaneously can exist at the same time. So that's something
Hmm.
like the first to keep in mind. And the second is that we know our morals cannot be derived from evolution. So it isn't the case that I say like, oh, and I think you've already kind of touched on this, that you said, oh, and this is something that's more like directed at Sam Harris.
I was
So
gonna ask you about him because he's the only like I haven't read The Moral Landscape, but I've seen like some reviews of it,
it's
and
terrible.
yeah,
Don't read it.
a lot of
Don't
people
read it.
say that. Yeah,
He's
I
not
actually
an
don't mind Sam
ethicist.
Harris. I liked his book
Mm-hmm.
on like free will.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I heard a lot of bad things about The Moral Landscape.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's not a moral ethicist, or I guess just an ethicist in general. And people who are ethicists say that his work is terrible. And I watched some like scathing reviews from like actual philosophers. So yeah, don't recommend that one. And if you
Yeah,
are interested in a good one, I can give you some good books maybe at the end of
yeah,
our talk
sure.
today. Um, Most of my knowledge though just comes from like lectures from my like classes. So unfortunately, I can't recommend too many books, but I have a few.
Are you like a philosophy major or?
Minor, actually.
Oh,
I wanted to get like a good job after college, and so a good career. So I decided to do economics instead. So economics is going
nice,
to be
nice.
my
Yeah, I've tried
major.
to do the practical degree,
Mm-hmm.
so I signed up for computer science, which
Mm-hmm.
I'm not like a tech person at all, but I was
Mm-hmm.
like, all right, let me do something practical. But if I was going off passion, I would totally go into something like philosophy or sociology. It's just a matter of what the fuck do you do after that,
Yeah, yeah,
Unless you
yeah.
want to go to school for like 10 years.
Sure,
Yeah.
I might do that.
You're still young enough. For
I
me, I
am,
started
yeah.
school late, so I'm like, shit, I'll be like complete dead egg by then. I gotta pop out some babies first.
Yeah, base. Yeah, we need more moms. We got to get the birth rates up. In any case, where was it going? Oh yeah, so I know that our morals are not derivable from like evolution. So even if we have like this value of altruism, I can't say that therefore like I can just use evolution to come up with what our moral system is, because science tells us what is true, what is the case, not what ought to be true. So if you
Hmm.
like study animals, like I think it's like horses. There's lots of animals that do this, but I know horses especially, they are known to like rape the male is known to like rape the female horse, and there's like clear that the female horse is like in distress when this happens. And so this might be like have some evolutionary feature to it. Might make it easier for the males to reproduce. But I think that just like from my moral experience, I would say that this is would be bad if humans did something like this. And so
Hmm.
again, there's a this gap between what is and what ought to be the case, and so that gap can't just be filled with like asserting that evolution is true. So basically,
Hmm.
yeah, science is descriptive. I'm talking about things that are prescriptive. So that's
Hmm.
another thing to keep in mind. The third thing is I don't think evolution is sufficient to explain a lot of our practices. I think a lot of like our esoteric practices, our spiritual practices. Personally, I don't think evolution can account for a lot of that. Um, and I'm somewhat biased in that sense, but I think just even like Hindu practices, for example, like if there's a cow crossing the road in India,
Hmm.
all the cars will stop and they'll let if the cow sits down, they wait. They don't go. And the cow stands up, leaves, then they can start like driving again.
Yeah.
And it's because they believe that like the cow is like a dead relative or a deceased ancestor, and so the cow is sacred. That's kind of like the
Hmm.
way they're coming at this. And this doesn't seem to me have any like intrinsic evolutionary value to it. It seems to
Well,
me
I'd say
that's just something.
religion.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say religion has a huge like evolutionary value to the point where even though like I personally am an atheist, I think
Mm-hmm.
that one of our huge issues in society right now is the loss of religion and not replacing it with some other kind of like secular system of traditions. Because now we're all just left with the things that science can't answer yet, and
Mm-hmm.
humans don't cope well with that. So that's why I think that we evolved religions and also to like help enforce social cohesion and behavior that'd be like preferable for the group.
Yeah, so
That's my
I
thought.
agree that on the like social cohesion part,
Hmm.
it definitely helps with that. I think it's the more the practices themselves, and I guess this is something that it's not something I've studied in detail. It's something that people like Rene Guénon and Julius Evola, and they've studied a lot of like the Buddhist, Shinto, pagan, Catholic traditions, and found like similar perennial values that they've each
Mm-hmm.
like demonstrated, but they've each expressed themselves very differently. And so I'd kind of like just refer to that as a way to say that I'm as a way to kind of say that I'm not sure if evolution can explain these things, because they certainly believe that there was something that was absolute. They called
Mm-hmm.
it like this supra reason, and so and perhaps I can get more into that after I do like the second argument, because the second argument talks about like our knowledge and epistemology, and so I feel like it might be easier to go into that side of it after that. But I definitely
Yeah, sure.
understand where you're coming from there, especially when if I'm making an argument from like moral experience, it makes sense to like try to bring up something like evolution. But I have to like add though that the reason why we can do science, of course, things like evolution, genetics, is that we have to assume, of course, the material world exists, right? And so this requires that properly basic truth that I can trust my senses. And likewise, my argument here is that before I can begin to act, I just have to assume that there's like some moral like realm where my moral sense tells me that there are objective morals.
Mm-hmm.
And because my moral sense would inform me of its existence. And so I don't think I can defeat either of these. Um, so I don't think like I can defeat it like I don't think like the moral sense would be able to defeat evolution. So I don't think that I can just use. I think some Christians have tried to do this before. Is I don't like they would say like, oh well, my moral sense tells me there's objective morality. Evolution can't explain that. People like William Craig might say this. Well, he believes in evolution, but he might say that like, therefore this undercuts the value of like science. And then someone like you would say, oh well, my belief in like the external reality, and then my even further belief in evolution would tell me that moral values don't exist. And so for me, I think that they both hold equal weight. And so like I'm just as convinced that the external world exists, that it's wrong to like torture and murder children. Um, and so I think that like any argument you can make against one, I can just easily make it against the other. I think they're like paralleled, and that's something that Louise and Antony, and she's an atheist philosopher.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that like she suggested, and so I don't think like morals counteract evolution and vice versa. And so I
Well, I
think
would
we have
look at
to.
them both as
Mm,
like theories of like probability. You know, that's the
mm,
way I view it. As like, I wouldn't say evolution is like a scientific fact. Like I would, project like facts in general as like this concrete objective thing that we can like necessarily perceive. So I think that kind of bleeds into like my view of morality. I'm viewing it from a different way where we can make um like we can decide on like preferable behavior or make estimations about what would probably increase like well-being and what would suit the most
mm.
preferences. But it's not, there isn't like that concreteness to it, which is just like unfortunate. Like,
Yeah,
but yeah.
yeah,
But
yeah.
I accept that, with the science world too. I don't believe that it's like an objective
Mm,
fact that anything exists or like that evolution is true.
yeah. So like I
Yeah.
said, I'm making an argument from like a properly basic truth, something that like it just seems like it's presupposed before we can have any like real interaction. Otherwise, and my argument isn't like that there's something like that's going to be logically impossible from saying that moral subjectivism is true, but rather that it's
Hmm.
going to be practically impossible. You can't really interact with anyone or have a like coherent like just worldview
Hmm.
in terms of like just the day-to-day interactions. That's kind of my argument, just to kind of like give that framework, give you that kind of background here. So I
Hmm.
understand definitely where you're coming from, and I will say that science is contingent, meaning that like our knowledge is always going to be expanding, and so even if like at this current like stage in our scientific process, we have certain concepts and ideas about what evolution is, it's very possible that those concepts will change. And so it's very possible, and there's no a priori reason to think that this isn't going to happen, that we'll discover something that would show us why objective morals exist, or we'll be able to show us something why this is possible. I have no idea. No one does, because, like I said, science is very contingent. We're always learning new things, and so there's no a priori reason to think that it is impossible for that to happen. So that's why I'm a very much compatibilist in that sense. I think that there is
Hmm.
objective morals. I think there is free will, and there also is uh, 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 like this, of course, like all the scientific, the method and evolution and cause and effect and those type of things at the same time. So I think that they both can coexist. And I think that the reason why I'd put preference on like my moral values is because I think that they come from, like I said, the moral experience, which I think is presupposed before I can even interact with other agents. And so it's almost like that
Mm-hmm.
is, in a sense, purely practical or a priori practical reason, whereas science is going to be a posteriori. So that's kind of like,
Gotcha, gotcha.
that's where I'd like put the emphasis on trying to like find the coexistence between the two. I will also add that there's a lot of unknowns in
Mm-hmm.
evolutionary like science right now, especially relating to something like altruism. Like we have Richard Dawkins in his book The Selfish Gene. I don't know if you ever read that one.
Like a long time ago. Yeah, yeah.
I read a little bit of it, but from like my from what like today we talked about it a little bit in my ethics class, and one of the things that he proposes is that like the reason why we're altruistic for like our family and our like our relatives is because we see them as like bearers of our gene package, and we
Yeah,
the
yeah.
purpose of evolution. This is actually a recent discovery by like Dawkins and et al. Is that the purpose is like pass down our genes, not so much just like survival in general. And so it makes sense that we would be altruistic with our friends, family, or rather just our family, and because we see them as people who are bearing our genetic code. But
Mm-hmm.
then the question is, why do we have altruism for complete strangers? Why is it? And
Mm-hmm.
I'm making an assumption here. I imagine that Ruby, you haven't met George Floyd, or you just like we you saw him on the television or on your like phone or whatever, and yet we have compassion for him. We
Mm-hmm.
can like empathize with him and whatnot. Uh, and I know for certainly you can, because you're definitely it seems to be like something that like leftists are very good at, with like the compassion.
Yeah,
Uh,
definitely. And yeah, that I would say is like not sure where the jump came from, but ultimately it's like we started, with our like a preference for like our kin and, having mostly like altruism for them and like selectively like passing our genes on. And then it expanded to our like broader tribes.
mm-hmm.
And the way I view it now, because it is interesting, because now it's like you can empathize with anyone in the world, and it seems like we empathize based on like mutual cooperation is the idea, but I'm not sure where the jump went. Like there's still like
Yeah,
things that don't
there
necessarily.
is no like good theory right now. The Richard Dawkins said that his explanation is basically that there is some like a malfunction of the gene, that the gene is just like malfunctioning.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for me, if like your scientific theory says the reason why you're altruistic and have that altruistic like tendency is because like your gene is malfunctioning, or if if it's because I have like this moral sense, my intuition is definitely going to lean on the side of the moral sense experience as this properly basic value. And so,
Mm-hmm.
like I said, this is just one argument. I have two more to go through. And so, is there any other like objections that you have? There's another one that usually comes up. I wasn't sure if you were gonna bring that one up though.
Well, you bring it up. Maybe I was gonna bring it up, but I don't remember.
Well, usually people talk about, if I talk about like moral experience, people say like, "Oh, what about moral disagreement?" Right?
Oh
Uh,
yeah, I guess that's like an obvious one.
yeah. So,
Um, yeah. So how would you respond to that, since there
mm-hmm,
are so many differing like perceptions
mm-hmm.
of morality? Like there's obviously like broad patterns, but there's also like many like variations.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, I'm glad you brought up the broad patterns. Well, to begin, I would say that moral disagreement isn't a necessarily a defeater, because of course we have like disagreements in science all the time. There are certain like things in logic and mathematics that there's lots of disagreement on. Like what is a number?
Mm-hmm.
When I found this out, I couldn't believe it. There's so much disagreement about what a number is. There are some people who are like Neoplatonists. They think numbers are abstract objects. There are
Yeah,
some people who think numbers are structures, and like mathematics has moved beyond that. They're not going to tell you that in like primary school, but
exactly. Yeah.
it's like there's a lot of disagreement here. But we know that there's one truth. There is an objective. There is some objective truth about what is a number. Is something that is like independent of like any individual mind, and so disagreement in general doesn't necessarily show that there is. It's not necessarily a defeater. However, with that being said, there is this proposition that is being touted by someone named James Rachels. and he's a moral philosopher, and he calls it soft universalism. And it basically that says that there are certain things that different like groups have all held in common, like a protection for the young. There's always been some
Hmm.
decent like respect for what one might consider like humanity or some like persons, and there's always been like prohibitions on lying and stealing and those type of things. So like you mentioned, you can find patterns. And so, of course, you have the counterexamples. Counterexamples like in some Islamic cultures, they will like traffic women, they treat women like dogs, or in some like native cultures, they have like cute child sacrifices, or in like some African tribes, they will like throw out like if there's like an albino kid, they'll just like throw him out in the cold, like abandon him. And so when it comes to some of these differences, what I'd say is that there's like a factual difference. And so when it comes to, for example, the for Islamic cultures, they think that women are like soulless, so they don't see them as actual persons. And so that means like they don't apply that same human decency. So that the value of human decency still exists, but it just doesn't apply to women because they have like this factual difference. The same with African cultures, the way they see like an albino person as someone who's been cursed, so it seems like they
Hmm.
lost their humanity. And then for like these tribes, and like the I don't know, like Polynesian tribes, or like the ones that are committing, or in like Aztec tribes, are having like human sacrifices. Like they're still trying to like save humanity by trying to like appease like the sun god or something like that, which they think
Hmm.
is going to either destroy them or it won't like give them a good harvest. And so they're fine. They're still, their objective is like this human decency. They're just arriving at it through these factually incorrect processes. And the same way that even in like the West and like in well most places they've practiced some form of slavery or another, but in like America and in like the Europe, like they for the longest time they thought either like African Americans, or I guess Africans in general, because I'm talking about Europe, and they were either like marked with like some cursed cane, or like they were just not like persons. They were not like me or
Hmm.
you, and so like it was okay to enslave them. Whereas if like you talk to a European and said, "Oh, can we enslave a European, like a white European?" They'd say, "Of course not. That would be a violation of human decency." And so over time, we've come to a more factually correct understanding of what it means to be a person, both from like just a biological sense and just from like just interacting with other people. You realize that, oh, maybe there's not as many differences as you once thought. And so it makes sense that our moral code would therefore progress by changing these factual differences, by abolishing slavery uh, and like expanding, this human decency to more and more individual groups. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So you
Mm-hmm.
think that like ultimately we're all in our imperfect ways moving towards like the objective morality, and there's just
Um,
people who are going about it in ways that are uh just they're not like
mhm.
factually correct in achieving that goal. Is what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that in some ways we've moved closer to it, and so, like certain potentials. I think in other ways we moved away from it,
Hmm.
uh, on social issues particularly, and I think that's because of like you mentioned, there's been a abandon of meaning, and so like I know that you're very proud of like some of the I guess defenses of hedonism. I'm not so much into that. I'm a
Oh,
little bit
I'm
more
shocked.
restrictive, yeah. So not probably a surprise there, but in some ways, I think that that we are moving closer to like certain just human decency when it comes to like something like sex trafficking or slavery or something like that, where I think we all agree that that's wrong and problematic, which is obviously moral progress. Another things which I think this would probably relate to the way you treat yourself. I think there's been
Hmm.
a lack of human decency, in my opinion. I think that people have gone away from personal autonomy and more to just living for the moment. And so I
Hmm.
think there's some moral degress there. But I think the principle of just decency for yourself and for others still is like a pattern, like you mentioned, between various cultures. And I think that even if you could say that, oh, this is just an evolutionary thing, it can be a moral value at the same time.
The thing is, I still have a hard time. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like you're claiming that like a objective morality can exist because we can perceive aspects of it, and there's this kind of like innate desire in
Mm-hmm.
humans to move towards this. You see it across cultures, even when people are imperfectly trying to reach that. I just don't understand how, like, like how it, like, so it just
How it would
purely,
work, right?
yeah. I
Because
guess there's still like
morals are
a
very
jump. I'm not
peculiar
like,
things, right?
Yeah, I'm having a hard time
I
just
mean,
picturing
like
it.
the way we know that my sense experience is real
Hmm.
is because I'm able to perceive it. So before I can like even talk about my senses in terms of like a concrete or even you could say scientific sense of smell, sight, hearing, is you have to be able to perceive. So before we can even talk about like what is a moral sense, you have to be able to sense the world morally in terms of this moral angle. And the thing about morality, unlike our senses, is that it's at a certain point it's kind of indivisible insofar as you can only get so far into like trying to understand it, like, well, what part of the brain is responsible for this or something like that. And the relationship between like the mind and morality, it's going to become very convoluted, and I don't think I don't have like a clear answer on that. And I don't think you necessarily have to invoke like a deity, but I think that you would have to go beyond just saying that there are like only atoms and molecules or something like that. And perhaps I can kind of get into why you should believe something like that with this next proof, because I think that it's easy to say then, oh well, I only believe that there are molecules and atoms or something like that. And so I think hopefully with this next one you can see why there it is like it is not only it's like practically imperative just from not only from like the moral sense, but just from like any type of rationality. You have to kind of have that presupposition there. And
Yeah, this
so,
is what's hard about talking about moralities.
yeah.
It's you get so far. Like this is why I haven't settled on one, because it's like at what it gets to a point of abstraction where it's
Mm,
just like I almost feel like our brains just can't
mm.
comprehend.
That's kind of
You
where
know?
I think most secular people are in
Yeah.
philosophy, because moral realism definitely has the high ground right now in the philosophy of ethics. I know sometimes you're concerned with the academic consensus. The academic consensus is on my side on this one, interestingly
Oh,
enough.
really?
Yes. In
Oh, I
fact,
didn't know that.
there's like the number of like philosophers that are like still advancing moral relativism. You can name them like on your hand.
Uh huh.
I don't remember. There was one guy, I forget his name. The other one that's really famous is J.L. Mackey. Um,
Hmm.
but especially within the ethics community, at least that's what all my ethics philosophers have told me, and that's what I read. I don't have like a peer reviewed study to give you though.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I'm, I'll take. Yeah, I'm still learning about it. Would you consider someone like Peter Singer to be like a moral realist?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
utilitarianism is definitely is Nietzsche, Sartre, all these people I would still say are moral realist.
oh, okay.
Like that basically since um, Socrates, after he kind of had the Erythro dilemma.
Hmm.
Uh, I hope I said that right. In which like you kind of like explain the problems with like divine command theory. Ever since then, people have like philosophers have been trying to develop a moral system based on just reason. And probably the best one I've seen is the Kantian deontology. But again, that's
Hmm.
normative ethics. We have to say that maybe table that for another time.
Yeah, isn't that's like the like virtue ethics? Was that his thing, or was that?
That was Aristotle. I think there's
Oh,
some
okay.
crossovers between the two.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
But it's his is about like trying to find these this a priori like categories of morality, things that would give us like before like I said before we even begin to act, some like system by which we can like plug in, okay, well this is like the circumstances. Now how should I ought to act if I'm going to be rational. Um,
Hmm.
and so that was kind of like his conception of it, and that's why I favor that one. But in any case, and I only bring that up just to show that like there have been philosophers who tried to just through reason alone, without like having to invoke like a deity or supernatural things. But at the same time, you're right; it's going to be very abstract. That's kind of the state of it. That's kind of what like what's his name, G.E. Moore. Yeah, G.E. Moore kind of said like the concept of the good is something that's going to be
Hmm.
very innocuous. It's not something that's
Yeah.
going to be, something that we experience in everyday reality the same way, I would experience like this sweater here. It's going to be a
Hmm.
very different type of experience. So hopefully, though, this next proof, I'd rather say next argument, will give us some more firm ground. And so this argument, this is kind of the schematized form. Really, the only premises that matter are kind of like the first one. But basically, the argument goes like this: if moral facts do not exist, then epistemic facts do not exist. Epistemic facts do exist, therefore, moral facts do exist. If moral facts exist, then moral realism is true, therefore, moral realism is true. And that's kind of just to show that the argument is valid. And now I have to like kind of explain what I mean by like, the first premise in moral
Yeah,
facts
because
do
I
not exist.
think
Yeah.
epistemic facts. I don't think I would agree that those exist necessarily.
Okay, so you're epistemic nihilist then.
I guess, yeah, I'm not sure exactly where I'd fall in it, but
Mm.
that's kind of like my intuitive reasoning of, yeah.
All right, well let's walk through it and we'll see kind of where you're at with that. So basically, I have to kind of show first of all, well, what do I mean by epistemic? Of course, that means like epistemology, the study of knowledge.
Yeah.
Knowledge is, as Plato said, justified true belief. So it's about which of our beliefs are justified, which our beliefs are going to be rational and true. There seems to be like, that's kind of the conjunct there. If it's justified, then we can say it's like has some truth to it. At least that's like kind of like a starting point. It has to be justified. So, and this is kind of what Terence Cuneo, this is how he worded it. And so I just kind of quoted him. Hopefully you'll allow me to just read off the quote. He just
Yeah,
did a
sure.
great job with that. I didn't feel like I could reword it much better than him. And so basically, what he's trying to argue here is that epistemic facts are similar to moral facts insofar as they're both prescriptive in nature. They put basically constraints on our behavior. And so both epistemic and moral facts, quote, indicate categorical reasons for agents to behave in certain ways. The fact that Sam's treatment of Margaret is wrong, so it's just like some example here, like Sam did something bad to Margaret. Sam's treatment of Margaret is wrong implies that there's a moral reason to disapprove of Sam's behavior. That applies to properly situated agents, regardless of the desires, projects, or concerns those agents may have. That's what we would mean by moral realism, right? So similarly, the fact that engaging in a particular plan of inquiry is manifestly irrational implies that there is an epistemic reason not to engage in that particular plan of inquiry. That implies that properly situated agents, regardless of the cares, projects, or concerns such agents may have, end quote. So like now you can kind of see how they're both like action compelling. That and of course, Ruby, I know that you pride yourself on having a worldview that is grounded, in studies, empiricism. I think either was it the Groyper debate or one of the ones I remember you saying that like, oh, my worldview is constructed on these justified principles and studies or
I mean, I'd
peer-reviewed
like to think
journals. And
so, I like to
yeah,
think I'm facts over feels, but,
exactly.
ultimately
Yes.
we determine our facts via our feels, so it's,
Oh, in some sense, but
yeah.
let me continue here. And then I think I can see where you're coming down from the epistemic nihilism. I'll address that, but I kind of have to first lay out what I mean by
Hmm.
epistemic realism and how that relates to moral realism, and then I can take down epistemic nihilism. So, which is grounded in studies and empiricism. So, like that's what your worldview is, like you said. And so, of course, you you put like you mentioned, you'd like to think that's like the case. You kind of put that on like a pedestal over like, let's say if someone just came up to you and said that their worldview was just shaped around like these ad hoc principles that they just randomly like it just arbitrarily adopted something like based on like whatever they were feeling that day. You would see this person as emotion, like their worldview is just directed by emotion or sensationalism, and so implicitly you are going to try to hold everyone to the standard that they have to actually justify their worldview. And so you definitely see yourself as being either like superior in a certain sense, or you definitely see that this person that they should be motivated, they should motivate themselves to have a worldview that is going to be justified, that is going to be backed up by rationale. And which is, again, this is going to be a normative concept, that there's going to be an action compelling duty on their end to back up their worldview with facts, logic, yada, yada, yada. And then more just to kind of cement the argument that there is a similarity here, that there's a lot of what you might call like a hybrid values. Just as having like this conversation right now, right? We presuppose like certain epistemic rules that I won't use like logical fallacies when I'm talking to you. I'm not going to try to like misrepresent your argument, use ad hominems, just call you like a dumb femoid or anything like that. No, you're not. You're definitely not. I'm not saying that, but to like an argument like that
Yeah.
someone that some internet people use, like something like that. I would never use that, but and I'm not saying that applies to. Let me be very clear about that. But what I'm trying to get here is like, yeah, using logical fallacies, things like misrepresenting your argument. These are things that we just like presuppose before we even had this conversation. I would not do. These are just like epistemic rules of interaction, and so these kind of portray And if I did do something like that, right? If I misrepresent your argument, I would represent like a right, or portray an a right, which is to say like a false picture of reality, which is like in epistemology something that you could call like epistemic vice. And so it's kind of easy to see how that might like translate into moral values. Something like misrepresenting an argument would correspond to being like honest, or treating someone with fairness. I want to make sure that I give you a fair hearing, for you the same to me. And so this reduces down to, again, human decency and respect. So even in our dealings in epistemology, you can see there's hybrid values, that they have a foot in both realm, so to speak. So there's like a nexus between the two. And so other examples include like being irrational. If someone's irrational, this denotes like a failure to be intellectually like open-minded, right? This means that they're going to be a failure to be reliable, objective. They're not going to be probably careful in their worldview. They're going to be very sloppy, among other things. You could even say that they lack a certain sense of autonomy. That instead of trying to come up with their own worldview, they're letting someone else think for them, or letting their emotions or just their inclinations be the master of their mind. And so again, these are these epistemic defects that we recognize. Just again, these are just intuitive, these epistemic defects. And yet they're also intellectual vices. They're things that in virtue ethics that they would definitely consider vices. And so you can see now kind of like the crossover. And the last one, I don't know if I guess I'll bring this up real quickly, but there's definitely what's called like the speech act thesis, which is to say there's an isomorphic or like a symmetrical structure between the epistemic and moral propositions. And so moral propositions can take like the semantic form of what are called like predicative statements, like F is A, or like John is nice. In the same way, you can like have epistemic claims that are very similar, like Sam's belief about UFOs is irrational. Or you can have also general moral statements, universal generalizations, like it's always wrong to lie. Or an epistemic version of that would be like beliefs grounded in solid evidence are justified. So you can kind of see now where the common usage would be, right? Does this kind of like make sense so far?
Yeah, I mean, my my feeble femoid brain is working overtime trying to comprehend, because it's like,
Well, it's all good. No, no worries. So, what parts are when you might be stuck on? Is it basically what I'm trying to get at here is like that.
I mean, it kind of seems like you're saying like, so it's like, it seems like there's like a jump in like justifying how something's true. Like it's true, you're saying like from a practicality, like it's practically true, therefore we should act like it's factually true.
No,
does that even make sense?
No, it's okay. It's more like epistemic virtues, like being rational, right? Having a worldview that's based and grounded on certain like principles of reason. This is something that we see that should be like a duty of ours. That as rational agents, this is what, and we don't even have to like think about valuing truth. You go up to a random person and say, "Do you value what's true?" They don't even have to answer that question without me asking something like, "Oh, do you believe in UFOs?" They say no. Why not? Because it's irrational. And they automatically just understand that this is like, again, this is kind of like a properly basic belief. And this is why I'm trying to make it a little bit easier to see now how like deep this goes, is that that our epistemic values, just our value of being rational, something like that, has the same qualities as a moral quality. And so now you can see just that what's at stake here, because any argument that you make against moral realism, like, oh, well, it's just from evolution, or it's just going to be from, or it's just like these arbitrary principles or whatever. I can make the same thing about epistemic values, that, oh, it's just that you value being rational, but I don't. I'm fine with being irrational, or something of that nature. And then you can quickly see like perhaps how like absurdity can arise from this pretty fast.
Yeah, and I agree, absurdity can rise from it pretty fast, but I sort of am an absurdist in the way that I see the world, is that it is absurd. So I still am struggling to make sense of.
Well, you see now like the layover between epistemic and moral values, right?
Yeah.
If you don't like, let me read the first premise and make sure that you at least agree to it for the most part. If moral facts do not exist and epistemic facts do not exist, would you like say, yeah, it's probably true? that if there are, like you said, if there are no moral facts, then there's going to be like an absurdity here, because even like an action driving principle to be like rational is something that can be questioned.
Uh, I'm not positive. I'd have to think about it more.
Okay, no, no worries. No,
Yeah,
that's good. That's good. All
yeah.
right, yeah, maybe think on that one. Um, like I mean, just like expressions that we use, is something unjustified, is something warranted, is it rationally entitled, insightful? These are all deontic expressions. So that's kind of
Hmm.
where I'm trying to build this bridge. Um, and so now the like what you said is that you've kind of just accepted some type of epistemic nihilism, right? Where you
Yeah, I think
basically,
so. Yeah.
yeah, where you're saying that, okay, well, maybe that's true, but then I'll just say, yeah, epistemic facts don't exist. Then there's nothing more meaningful about being justified than being unjustified, or having a worldview that is going to be based on rationality, or a view
Hmm.
that's based on irrationality. And I think this will bleed into the third proof about like why I don't think that this is something that you can actually like live with, practically speaking. But
Well, yeah,
before,
practically. So, yeah, I would act. It's kind of like how I don't think free will exists,
mm,
but, I behave as if it does. So even if,
yeah,
like, intellectually, I do behave as though, certain facts exist in order to just function in the world. Yeah. So,
well, that's kind of what I'm getting at. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
is that that these things, we have to assume that they exist at a functional level,
Hmm.
even if like we can't prove them on a theoretical level. I don't think you can disprove some of what I'm saying on a theoretical level either, but certainly that I don't think you can like use the scientific method, at least at the current moment, to arrive at some of what I'm saying.
Hmm.
But basically, the reason why I would push against epistemic nihilism is I think there's like three very undesirable results that'll basically lead you into a state of very like uncomfortable absurdity, and one that I know for sure you have not taken and I have not taken. And like they say, I think there's like a famous quote that like skeptics only exist in the textbooks or something like that. Like there's
Uh,
no such thing as like an actual person who's an absurdist in like the way they
hmm.
live life. And
Yeah, yeah,
so
exactly.
the first undesirable result is that either epistemic nihilism is going to be justified or it's not going to be justified. And so if you say, oh, well, yes, epistemic nihilism, I think is justified, you say because X, Y, or Z, because everything could be reducible to evolution or some other argument like that, well, then you've just conceded the premise that our beliefs should be justified. And so then it's like epistemic nihilism is therefore self defeating. Or you can just say, yeah, epistemic, or you might say that I have no like sufficient reason to believe in epistemic nihilism. It's just something that maybe I just ad hoc hold to, or just like woke up one day and say, I believe in epistemic nihilism. And then that implies that there's no epistemic like reasons fortiori, which means to say like more likely than not that I should believe in it. So if you just like came up to me and said, "Oh yeah, I believe in epistemic nihilism," I said, "Oh, do you have like a justification behind that belief?" And you said no. And I'd be like, "Okay, well then I'm not going to take you seriously as like a
Hmm.
rational individual. It sounds like you're more just like gone like monkey mode or something." And so, like I mentioned, the part of like the moral code is just presupposed in this interlocutor, the fact that there are interlocutors, or there are like we have these connections with interactions rather with other rational beings. And so then the second part is that if epistemic nihilism is true, let's just barring like the first one, let's just say it is true. There is no reason to believe it, like I mentioned, which implies a radical version of epistemological skepticism, according to which no entity can display any like sort of epistemic merit or demerit.
Hmm.
And so if you say basically that that it's like just as equally meaningful to be irrational as to be rational, and everything that follows from that, be it all of our beliefs, our knowledge, even like our practical knowledge about like, oh, my grandma exists instead of doesn't exist, and the justification that sits on, all of that can then be questioned. And so then all of these like just everyday beliefs, immediately there's no merit or demerit to believing them or not believing them. So you're, I guess, again forced into this weird position of skepticism.
Yeah,
And the
that's see, that's where I'm intellectually stuck. I don't behave in a way that's in accordance to what like I'm intellectually perceiving as what is possibly true about the
Mm-hmm.
nature of reality. I act, with certain presuppositions and like moral axioms that are like needed to function.
Yeah.
Uh, but I still don't see a place of authority where you can. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I'm having a hard time.
Legislate the law to yourself, you can say. Yeah. So why should we? Because I think it sounds like you're starting to concede that yeah, maybe there is some these practical rules that seem to arise just from our everyday interactions, but where they arise from seems to be a mystery. And what would like enforce them? Like you have like okay, why should I consider or more like who legislates the laws to them to myself?
Hmm.
Is that kind of the question?
Well, yeah, because for it to be
Mm-hmm.
like objective, yeah, that has like some authority to it that's beyond just like, because I think there's universally kind of like preferable behavior, you could say,
Mm-hmm.
but like it's ultimately, yeah, I see it as like an evolved trait without some type of like uh intrinsic meaning to it. Like in
Mm-hmm.
general, I don't believe in like intrinsic meaning to anything,
Yeah,
unfortunately. It's
that's why I'm trying to
like,
convince you that there is some intrinsic, well, at least that there is some objective code. From there, you can like get. At first, you have to establish that there is some objective morality before you can say that sure that there would be an intrinsic meaning to something, or rather,
mhm,
I'd say maybe an intrinsic value. And for something to be an intrinsic value, it wouldn't mean that it's like it's actually the value is in the object itself, but rather that it would be necessarily the case that all rational agents would value something like that. And so, like, of course, we have our individual things that we subjectively value.
mhm.
You value, I don't know, vaping. You value vaping. You like vaping. I value like ties or something like that. Something silly like that. We place our own like subjective value in certain things, and so something that would have innate value would be something that necessarily all persons would have to value that one thing, and that
But
they.
wouldn't that be like
Mhm.
extrinsic value if it's like reliant on like an external thing? You
Well,
know
it'd
what I
just
mean?
be it's just mind dependent. So I'm not
Hmm.
saying that it exists like outside of any one mind, but it would still be. I guess you could say it's innate insofar as though I guess absolute is probably maybe a more accurate way to say it's has an absolute value. So that like
Hmm.
it would be just as valuable to you as it would be to me. Kant is able like through he used and it would take way too long to have to like talk like go through like how he arrives at this way. He believes that just our rationality is something that we all have to value, and so therefore we should treat each other not as means to an ends, but always as innate ends with decency and respect. Something that I
Hmm.
think that we all. Just through sense experience understand, but he through reason is able to arrive at that as something that is innate. Um, Again, that's again normative ethics. The question is
Hmm.
though, is there a moral law that would apply to me? Something that would have like that when I'm having like an interlocutor or talking to another person in a conversation, is there some constraint that I should be aware of that would influence my behavior?
Hmm.
And that's kind of what I'm trying to get at here. And then if you deny that there is this constraint, then you've also forfeited any ability to basically um, uh, I guess, give a superiority to rationality over irrationality.
Hmm.
And so basically, you're reduced to this uncomfortable position of just absurdity where you have no reason to be either. And so you have no arguments really for anything because there is no like merit or it's no more meaningful or less meaningful to like for me to like be here today. I'm giving arguments, right now for objective morality than against it.
Hmm.
And so you can't even assert that, oh, epistemic nihilism is true, because even in inserting that, you would be assuming that it's justified.
Yeah.
And so you basically are just like forced into this position of like just ad hoc, just you basically become an animal is what I'm trying to get at, where
Well, I
you're
view
not,
I view
you're,
people as animals,
well,
so I,
I mean
yeah,
by like an animal in the sense that non-human animal, where like we don't
I
have
give a lot
ability
of
to
moral
ration.
consideration to non-human animals too. Also,
Which I
but I
think
know
is interesting.
they're not necessarily moral agents. I mean, some
Mhm.
primates can be, but
Maybe. Um, um, but what I mean is kind of you just going off their instinct or inclination. You have no ability to reason or think through things. And then I think the third proof will kind of cement why this is problematic. And
well, I
this
think you
is,
could still have like reason, and that's the thing that drives like our our conception of like moral development
Hmm.
is we use reasoning to decide what would maximize things that are preferable. So I see it as like a combination of preference and reason and like group cohesion.
Hmm.
That's kind of like the trifecta of what I see as like the justification for morals without like an objective like authority, if that makes
You
sense.
could say that some morals are, perhaps you could say that some of our values derive from that. But again, if you say that like a moral values come from that, then they are easily defeatable because again, you're just giving me a description of what's true. You haven't given me any reason why I ought to value that. So if
Mm-hmm.
you can say, oh yeah, it's about group cohesion, and that's great. But what if I don't value group cohesion? I was talking to this one guy, and he was saying that oh, all our values just come from our genetics. And so I was like, okay, well, why should I value something that my genetics tells me? And he was trying to make the argument that like mixed racing was wrong or something on that like grounds. Um, and so I was like, okay, but why should I value that? Because he was trying to say that it was worse to like to commit mixed racing than to commit like fornication. Which I think is interesting because it's like I can see which one that you probably struggle with, and so why you might have preference for like that one over the other.
Yeah.
He was like one of the wingnut type, so not like the America First groiper people.
Are
And
you a America First Groper person?
y- yes,
Why do you guys always hesitate? I never get a clear like, yes, I am a
it's like it's
Groper.
such a meme
It
word that I don't
is.
feel like like I want to like appear to be like a serious person, and so if I say yeah I'm a groiper, I'm like I do some internet trolling or I go troll Charlie Kirk or something like that. I immediately lose like probably some value in your eyes, and so well that's why the only reason I hesitated. Like the way I would refer to myself is just that I'm just like a paleo conservative. I'm a conservative of my great grandfather's age. I'm not a fascist or a white nationalist or those ideologies. I'm just interested in preserving American culture and American values.
So
Uh,
you're like, what would have just been a normal conservative like 100 years ago is kind of like your.
yeah, I want to
I
preserve
gotcha,
like
gotcha.
America, just American founding stock and American values. Yeah, that's
So
kind of
you're a
what I
white
think.
nationalist, or
No,
we don't know what to get
well,
it.
I am an American nationalist. I think that there's a racial aspect to that. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think race is everything, but I don't think it's nothing. I don't think that if you brought in like a whole bunch of Japanese people, that they would be able to like become America or build the same America that we built. In the same way that like if a bunch of even if like a bunch of Japanese people move to North Korea, North Korea wouldn't like that because they're probably not going to accept the Junche doctrine. They're going to bring with them values of Shintoism and things like that. And so my ancestors were actually part of the founding stock. Interestingly enough, my on my father's side of the family, they arrived from like the Anabaptists. They
Mm-hmm.
were fleeing religious persecution. They were like Mennonites. Some of my family are still traditional Mennonites. So they date back to the late 1600s. They arrived in this country and they're dissidents. That was kind of just in they had proclivities to that. I think there's something somewhat either genetic. They're part of like their Anglo heritage or that culture. And then on the other side of the family dates back to the Mayflower. So again, they're
Mm-hmm.
fleeing religious persecution, and so there's certain Christian values, and I think values of resistance and being dissidents and having this like certain a form of rugged individualism, being trailblazers. I think that these are certain values that are uniquely American and uniquely some things that I want to like see preserved.
Mm-hmm.
That's just where I kind of come from this. I'm not even. That's why I say I'm not a white nationalist because I think maybe like an Italian is more likely to be able to adapt to our values, but I wouldn't want the whole nation to be Italian either. I
Mm-hmm.
I would wish the whole nation to be American. That's like the people just like who founded the country, who started off like in the very beginning. So that's
What
kind
about
of
black people?
yeah, and so I think that they have a legitimate right to this nation as well,
Uh-huh.
because we brought them here. It was obviously a terrible mistake what happened with slavery. It should never have happened, both for like moral reasons and just like because of what we're seeing now with the a lot of the racial conflict that
You do
happened
do you
because of
think
that.
we can't move past that? I'm just curious. Are you like a Jared Taylor fan or something?
Do I think we can't move past racial conflict? Well, I think freedom of association is just the best way to move past it. Just have like different like like communities do their own thing. Um, I don't think that we should force communities to try to get along, like through like. But that's I know that's very off topic.
I know. Yeah, I almost don't
Uh,
even want to. Yeah, I don't.
and I
That
know what
is
I'm
very
saying is
off topic.
probably. I'm sure right now your moral sense is saying that this is abhorrent. He wants to bring back segregation, which is not exactly what I said. Um,
Yeah.
yes, I do lean to the American first fight. I mean, I consider myself a perennial traditionalist, so I think that there are, which is again, it goes back to Vol. I think there are certain of these innate like values that are just that are it's like basically forming the foundation of who we are, and that they're going to manifest themselves in unique ways based on the population, based on the genetics of the gene pool that's like in the area.
Hmm.
And that's why I don't even like they get into like all the debate about. Well, I mean, to some extent I might, but about like the race and IQ thing, because like even like Asian people have higher IQs than Americans, and yet I don't think someone from Japan is going to be able to build America. I think that there's a unique genetic pool that is unique, like that represents what America is to me, the same way as it represents Japan, and the that concept of like ethnicity being real is something that even geneticists like David Reich admit. So I don't think it's that controversial.
Yeah, I
Whereas,
guess the controversial thing is
mhm,
the authority of which, like, race realists tend to take a bunch of uh like some, there's like valid scientific data about like group differences and whatnot, but they take it and then construct it into like, we have like,
mhm,
all right, it is now a fact that we know that like black people have like this genetic,
mhm,
like they have this genetically fixed IQ,
mhm.
like, which is just, it's almost comical because the field of genetic studies is so
Yeah,
new.
it's very
And the
complex. Yes.
brain is the least understood organ like at all. We look at like, when we do
Yeah.
like MRIs, we see just parts light up and we're like, maybe that means something. So I think it's like
Mm.
funny when people act like, all right, we've got it like, figured out in that department. um
Yeah. So I definitely understand where you come from. Hereditarians. Uh, I don't want to be like sound too mean. I think that to a certain extent you might have straw manned them. At least the ones I've talked to, the more sophisticated ones. Like I think that the way they see it is more like they're offering a model that would explain why there's this group difference, and they think that their model makes more sense if you look at like the heritability of IQ, and then also like if you look at the way populations have existed in different areas. But I'm not the one to talk about this. Rocket, I'm
mhm,
sure you've interacted with him. He's more going to be a little more He's going to give you more sophisticated scientific answers. I can
mhm.
only like refer to like a few of other sources I've read, but um,
Yeah,
I
that's okay.
understand
I'm
there's like
still,
30 different genes associated with IQ and intelligence. I know it's very complex, and I wouldn't say that it's like a fact that um, that like, or I would say that it's manifestly obvious, something like this. I'd say that it is just a reasonable hypothesis. Um, that's kind of like where I would go from, and then that mixed with like history would give me like intuition that this is probably a more probable theory.
mhm.
And that isn't just because like I innately just hate black people or something like that. That's not at all the way I came at this. I was just looking at this from this like the most objective kind of like standpoint as I possibly could.
Mhm.
But in any case, what I do want to actually say though about like all this, like we're talking about science and about like genetics and that type of research, right? Now all of that is very contingent upon the scientific method, and
Mhm.
of course the scientific method can't prove itself. The scientific method requires some philosophy of science, right?
Mhm.
And so this requires some conception of epistemology, physics, metaphysics, or rather, yeah, metaphysics. All these things are kind of presupposed before we even are able to talk about these or make like an sense of reality.
Mhm.
And so excuse me, sorry, one second, I gotta get a drink real quick.
No, you're fine. Yeah,
The
for me it's like, it's an important distinction
mm,
to just be like, I can operate as if this is true, but also recognize that a lot is presupposed. I guess that's like
yes.
the big differentiating thing, is I'm not viewing it as like there's a moral fact and going like, or like a scientific, you know what I mean? Like a
Mhm.
fact in general.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And so
I just,
before you
yeah.
can even the thing is about the scientific like science like I'm mentioning here is that so now we know the scientific method can't prove itself. Scientism is self-defeating, because if we say all knowledge comes from science, well, that statement itself, we're saying that that is part of our knowledge, and yet you can't back that up through science. And so empiricism is has some as problems. And then also, if you're a rationalist, all our beliefs come from reason itself. Well, what is the reason for assuming the supremacy of reason? You're going to be caught in this infinite regress. And so
Hmm.
before we can even begin to make sense of anything really intelligible, you have to have this like supra reason. And that's why I think that moral values and these very innocuous concepts would exist. I also think that things like faith and some spiritual aspects, that's where they would also like kind of reside in this very abstract notion. But it's one that I don't think that you can like brush away by looking at science, because this
Hmm.
has to be presupposed before we're even able to do any science. And like I mentioned, the relationship between epistemology, I believe that like I try to justify, there's a relationship between moral realism and epistemic realism. And so if you're going to talk about well, look at these genes and let's look at talk about IQ. We're just presupposing that I don't use logical fallacies, that it matters, it's meaningful that we have a rationally justified worldview. And so that's
Hmm.
why when I say that just to even have like just day-to-day conversations, it is just a properly basic belief that there are for one, these epistemic values, and then that would imply that there's also these moral values as well, and they do
So
really
they
exist.
exist because we need them to exist, kind of, or
uh
in order to function. So it's like
kind of.
metaphorically true, or is that the?
And I would say that they are true. I don't like the term metaphorically, because that makes them sound like they exist only like in like this. They exist intangibly,
Hmm.
as the same way that the external reality exists. I would say it's like the same way as I would say that this mouse exists is the same
Hmm.
way the objective morals have to exist in my mind. Um, and finally, let me just transition that into my last argument here, and this kind of like wraps it up. Is the argument from what's called like the moral nexus. And I was already kind of hinting at this, talking about the interlocutor, or like the way you'd interact with other people. And this is what Jay Wallace, he's a famous Kantian ethicist, and let me just read off his quote, because again, I think he did a great job wording this. Couldn't really do it better. And so basically, he's arguing here that an objective moral code is going to function as like a mechanism to like resolve conflict. So that's kind of its like function, you could say. And so moral theories must give us this framework to resolve our differences, or to reconcile or resolve our differences. And so this is his quote here. Quote, morality may be thought of as a set of normative constraints on attitudes and actions that stem from the fact that we inhabit a common world together with other moral agents. More specifically, it may be thought of as a normative nexus that links us individually with each of the persons who might potentially be affected by what we do. End quote. And so basically, we all have certain ends that we choose, and we all further employ certain means to ascertain these ends. And so we share, a common world. No one lives in like a vacuum. And so my actions, they're going to affect you, and your actions are going to affect me, and they have ripple effects. Even if like we're very much separated across space. Here, you live on the East Coast, I live on the West Coast. But our actions in general, they affect my family, the people I interact with on a day-to-day basis. And so there's going to be like what we call in like economics externalities to what we do. And so it seems necessary that we have to have certain laws that will like order our pursuit of happiness, so to speak, that they give us like this order, they give us like this structure, so that when we have conflicting or mutually exclusive ends, then we're able to find a way to resolve them. They give us the key to unlocking how to resolve these conflicts. And of course, conflict is like the opposite of being rational. And so when we talk about conflict in philosophy, basically we're setting aside, all like this civil discourse we're having. You've set down the textbook and you've entered into like the state of just nature. And as Hobbes said, it's going to be, our lives are going to be nasty, brutish, and short. And so there must exist these like predetermined guides or predetermined structure, which can orient how we ought to interact with other agents. And it acts as like just this prerequisite before we, like I mentioned, before we interact with other rational agents who may be potentially affected by our actions. And so that's kind of like, you might say, like, is the function of like the moral code, so to speak. That's
Hmm.
kind of like what it's like, its task is to do for us.
Gotcha, gotcha. All right, I think I understand where you're coming from. Also, I'm
Mhm.
sorry, my brother's cat is being so
It's
annoying
all
right
good.
now. I just started meowing so loud. Like, but yeah, I definitely it's something I want to do more research
Hmm.
into because I used to think that moral objectivism was just kind of like only religious perspective.
Hmm. I thought that too when I before I took my first ethics class. I remember that.
Yeah, yeah. So it's something I'm interested in learning more about because I always do. I just get caught up in the absurdity of it.
Yeah.
And then once I get to that point, I'm just kind of like, why do I even think about this stuff? Like,
Yeah.
why do I torture myself
Hmm.
and keep myself in like this existential crisis like all the time? You know.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, you know, and it's
Hmm.
important to know. So
I,
yeah.
to go back real quick to like the irrationality one. Another reason, again, that like the two, all the proofs kind of work together. That if someone is like has an irrational worldview, oh excuse me, like let's say that someone is like, you know, a someone who has my worldview, I'm sure, but they instead of like coming at it maybe more reasonably, like they just like one day they just realize that they don't like black people or something like that, and so now they're going to be racist, or and so it's just completely unjustified, right? You don't
Hmm.
want that person, I imagine, voting, because that's going to affect your life, and or you don't want to probably have to interact with that person. So again, the way we interact with each other, there has to be these prerequisites that we're going to act rationally. This is kind of like the way we're going to be autonomous, right? And so instead of just like beating each other with clubs all the time and being in a perpetual state of war, that we instead act like civil humans, civil adults. And so if I have like some end I'm trying to achieve and you have yours, we try to work it out in this rational manner. And that's what the
Hmm.
moral law gives us, is this structure of how to act rationally. And so the same way that like logic, the laws of logic help us to act rationally in a theoretic sense, like they're going to tell us how if all men are bald and Socrates is a man and Socrates is bald, it helps us like resolve the that intellectual conflict there. It helps to
Hmm.
resolve our practical conflicts. So
Hmm.
that's kind of like the that's kind of like my final concluding statement there.
So you think like a moral law, like in the way that logic exists, like we have like like a moral
Oh,
equivalent of
absolutely, yeah.
that?
Absolutely, because I believe that, yeah, morality is necessary like logic is, and
Mm-hmm.
I think morality is presupposed like logic is. And I think it's prescriptive like logic is. It tells us how logic tells us how we ought to think, um, and just like morality tells us basically how we ought to act.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't explain logic from just like science. You can't explain like where like these logical principles come from. Why is it the case that um, uh, like modus ponens, if P then Q, and if you have P then YQ. This is not something you'll be able to reduce to scientific processes alone. In fact, there's actually a lot we can't reduce to science.
Mm-hmm.
Things like the satisfaction of the aesthetics. Like I mentioned, I don't think morality is going to be able to be reduced to that. Um, William Lane Craig gave like a bunch of good examples. I'm trying to remember them all now, but yeah, definitely logic is one of those. The fact that and this is I guess another point of contention is whether or not there's things that are like you could say are objectively beautiful. So the satisfaction and the aesthetics is something that can't be. Metaphysics, of course, concepts
Mm-hmm.
like substance and causality, and so that's why we rely on philosophy to do a lot of these things. And so that's why the number one thing I'd encourage you to do is to try to be able to open yourself up to a worldview that isn't going to be limited to perhaps like your scientific conception, but to
Mm-hmm.
understand that there's going to be some abstract things that we oftentimes we just take them for granted. Oh, is that the dog?
Yeah, this
Ah, the
is.
dog's coming out. Is that a boy or a girl?
He's a boy. This is Darby. He's very dirty right
Ah,
now. Say hi, Darby.
yeah.
He's been feeling neglected. But yeah, it's my
We've
baby
been.
boy.
I mean, yeah, we've been going for a while now. So yeah, that's kind of and I don't think I have anything more to say about that. So yeah.
No,
So
it's definitely it's food for thought. If you have any book
mhm.
recommendations,
Yeah, yeah.
get
Um
something at Audible.
mhm.
Yeah, you can send
So
me some.
one of them is going to be the book by Jay Wallace is called I think it's called The Moral Nexus. Sorry, let me just make sure. Um that's the right book. That's the one he wrote. Yeah, The Moral Nexus by Jay Wallace. And so he goes into like kind of like the third argument that I'm talking about there.
Hmm.
The second argument is like just intensely, like very densely argued by Terence Cuneo in the book. And I can like send these to you over Discord in case like just you have like the name of it down. And it's called, I think, The Normative Web. Yeah, that was the name of his book.
Hmm.
And that book is philosophically dense. So if you have like questions, definitely we can definitely like stream again or sometime if you have like certain parts you're like kind of confused about. He uses a lot of the existing material, and
Hmm.
so he goes after some like probably the more like sophisticated or more intensive arguments against like moral realism, things by like J.L. Mackie. And so, and tries to tackle like your naturalistic objection. And one of the same things that he actually interestingly says is that he is more convinced that morals are real than naturalism is true. And that if he had to choose one, he would go with the rejection of naturalism in favor of like objective morals because of the fact that epistemology rests on this and the importance of epistemology in our everyday lives. And so he's a great source. A lot of like the information I had today came from him. Trying to think if there's anyone good for the first argument. I guess Louise Antony. I guess she might have some work on it. A lot of
Hmm.
those arguments I got from William Lane Craig. Um, a lot of people see him as like a pseudo like philosopher, but he's actually has a philosophy, like he has a PhD in both philosophy, and I think he has like one in theology, and I think he's trying to get another PhD in mathematics. And so like I often try to see what the arguments he's trying to make are.
Yeah.
Um, of course, he's a Protestant, a Catholic. Of course, he probably actually know this. He thinks that you have to have God to have objective morals. I don't necessarily think you do. I think you have
Hmm.
to probably go beyond just like atoms and molecules, but I don't think you have to go to the point of actually believing in God. At least the way it's been traditionally understood. Um, Let me see. I'm trying to think if there's any other books. If you're interested in normative ethics, and definitely get Kant's book,
Hmm.
Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. That's one of the easier books he has to understand. And in it,
Yeah, whatever the easier ones, because sometimes I pick up
mhm.
these books. I dropped out of high school, so I don't have like
Oh,
a
no worries.
super high education.
It's all good.
But yeah, so I'm, it has to be something.
Mhm.
Usually, like a lot of what I learned about philosophy is just from like reading like Wikipedia or like
It's
articles,
not
which
bad.
can
It's
be,
not a bad source.
yeah, it's not the worst thing, but
I feel like William Lane Craig would probably be the most accessible then, because he definitely talks to like the try to talk to like the lay audience without
yeah,
having to use certain jargon like deflationary and inflationary and regressive. Like these were all terms that Terence Cuneo was using, and I was like, what? I don't know what you mean by this, and I was like, I'm definitely not going to bring this up because this is like way too abstract for even like myself
yeah,
to understand
yeah,
what he's
yeah.
trying to say here. Jay Wallace, I think, should be good though. From like what I've seen of him, he's pretty straightforward. Um, Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, I think, is a great one, an introduction to like normative ethics and
Hmm.
like understanding um, the relationship between like our inclinations and like autonomy and reason. And so he's basically saying that one of the things he argues is that like, and he kind of steals this from Rousseau, and this is again normative ethics. So this is already presupposed that there are objective morals, but the reason why that you would want to, or I guess the reason why you would legislate the moral law to yourself is the same way you'd legislate like the social contract to yourself. You've given up like
Hmm.
you might call like a natural liberty of a state of nature in order to have like civil liberties, to have like a state of like we're living in a civil society. In the same way
Hmm.
you legislate the moral law to yourself, even if it is only implicitly. I don't think anyone like explicitly thinks about this, but implicitly they legislate the moral law to themselves, and so they give up this just living a life off of inclination or absurdity, and now are able to live in a like a rational manner. And so not only will they like be able to like reason in terms of like logic rationally, but even in their interactions day to day, there's a rational and like a ordered like pursuit of, they're able to order their pursuit of happiness in like a conducive manner, avoids conflict, and
Sweet.
allows you to be autonomous.
All
So
right.
that,
Well, yeah, definitely send
mhm.
me. I don't know if I'll remember all this, but
No, it's
yeah,
all good. Yeah, I'll
send me some
definitely send those.
recommendations. All right, I
I
should
can
take this
send
guy
you
out.
some sources too if you need like help getting them for cheap. By cheap I mean free, and by free
Oh
I mean
yeah.
pirated.
Yeah, that'd be great. I hate
But then
everything that's like behind a paywall, you
I know
know.
I do too, especially
So annoying. It's
scholarly
like education
articles.
should be free. You know,
I
I hate
agree.
it. I'll like look something up and I'll be like, ooh, this looks juicy, and then it's like behind a paywall.
Yeah, yeah. I think our moral sense agrees here.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. All right. Well, it was nice
All right,
chatting
thank you.
with you.
Yeah, I think we had a
All
great
right.
discussion, and
Yeah.
I definitely learned some new things about like some of your questions. They have definitely provoked some thoughts in my mind about things that still on unanswerable and things that I need to think about more. And hopefully, I've sparked some interest in for yourself.
Yeah, yeah. It's a journey. I'm definitely like
Mhm.
it's something I'm interested just in learning more about to see because it's a lot of yeah.
For
It's
sure,
very
yeah.
complicated. So I'm on
It is.
my
It is.
my journey of like trying to find a moral
Mhm.
philosophy that like is more coherent so I'm not just always like, you know, floating
Yeah.
around in absurdity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you definitely should look into one if you're going to like if we're going to talk about the necessity of being rational or the necessity of like compassion or the values I'm sure that you prioritize human decency, things like that. So you have like some more objective basis, a ground, firmer foundation to stand on when they're talking about
Yeah.
politics, and it'll make it a little easier too if you're talking to like people about like applied ethics. Then you can
Mhm.
kind of already kind of see where they're coming from, what like the moral law means to these people, and
Yeah,
about
yeah.
like its function. Like I said, about the way it's able to orient and our actions in a practical manner to resolve conflict. And it's something that's kind of somewhat innate to some people and things like that. Now, hopefully, that gives you a little bit more some tools to kind of work with to start give you maybe a starting like some more like I guess a firmer ground and also a more even ground when you're talking to people on like my side when you're talking to people like Jordan about what was it OnlyFans or I
Yeah,
think you
yeah.
talked to some other guy about polyamorous relationships maybe or
I
simping.
mean,
I don't
anything
remember.
degenerate tends to come up on my channel for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I did a simp debate.
Mm-hmm.
Like that was
That's
pretty
pretty fun.
funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was surprised that I didn't see any other simp debates on YouTube.
Mhm.
So I was like, I've got to fill this void, you know.
I guess
But
they did worried they'd get laughed off the internet.
I mean, yeah,
Defendant, maybe.
it's pretty goofy material, but you know,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, I appreciate you having me on.
yeah,
I'm trying to think if there's any other good closing remarks. I'm not very good with these formalities here.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. It's fine.
thank you for having me on.
All right,
And I hope maybe we can do this again sometime. I'll have you on my show. Maybe we can arrange a debate if you'd ever want to have that on my show. Or
all right,
I'm glad we had this
awesome.
conversation.
Yeah, yeah, no,
So
it's fun.
thank
All
you
right,
so much for giving me this opportunity to like talk about these things.
yeah, no, of course, thank you.